The hallways of Northgate High echoed with laughter and chatter. Lockers slammed shut. Students rushed to class, but Robby Bankson walked with his head down, a solitary figure in the crowded hallway. He was an outcast, a ghost. Kids whispered about him, their words like daggers. "Freak," they hissed. "Weirdo." Robby clutched his books tighter, his knuckles white. He hated this school, hated the stares, hated the whispers. Most of all, he hated the way his clothes felt. Too tight, suffocating. Beneath the fabric, bruises ached. A constant reminder of the hell he faced at home. He longed to disappear, to melt into the faded paint on the lockers, but he knew that escape was impossible. Not here. Not at school, where everyone could see through his facade. Home offered no solace either. Home was a different kind of hell. The Bankson house stood on a street of forgotten dreams, cracked sidewalks, overgrown lawns, and houses with peeling paint. Inside, the air hung heavy with the stench of stale beer and simmering rage. Robby's father, a hulking shadow of a man, ruled their home with an iron fist and a voice thick with alcohol. Every creak of the floorboard, every slammed door sent shivers down Robby's spine. He lived in a constant state of fear, never knowing when the next explosion would erupt. His mother, once full of life, now moved like a ghost, her eyes downcast, her spirit broken. Robby hated his father, hated the way he reeked of cheap whiskey and anger, hated the way his mother flinched at his every move, hated the way he felt powerless to stop it. The beatings were a regular occurrence, a terrifying ritual that left Robby battered and bruised. He wore long sleeves even on the hottest days, hiding the marks that told a story of pain and fear. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional torment that gnawed at him. He felt utterly alone, trapped in a nightmare he couldn't escape. Then Michael came into his life. A new kid in school, Michael was different. He didn't see the scars, didn't hear the whispers. He saw Robby. They met in the library, two souls seeking refuge among the dusty shelves and the scent of old paper. Michael loved stories, tales of adventure and fantasy. Robby, lost in his own darkness, found himself drawn to Michael's light. They talked for hours, sharing secrets and dreams. For the first time in his life, Robby felt seen, heard, understood. Michael became his confidant, his only friend. They spent their days exploring the woods behind the school, their laughter echoing through the trees. For a little while, Robby could forget the darkness that clung to him. He could almost believe that things might be different, that maybe, just maybe, he could find a way out of the abyss. But the darkness had a way of seeping into every crevice of his life, of twisting even the purest of joys. It started with nightmares. Vivid, terrifying nightmares. Robby would wake up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding in his chest. The dreams were always the same. He would see himself, his reflection twisted and contorted into something monstrous. His skin would be an angry red, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. And surrounding him, whispering his name, were creatures of shadow and flame, demons. Their eyes burned into his soul, their voices promising power and destruction. Robby would try to scream, to break free from the grip of the nightmare, but no sound would escape his lips. He would wake up gasping for air. The sheets tangled around him like a shroud. The line between dream and reality blurred. The whispers followed him throughout the day, a constant murmur at the edge of his awareness. He felt a change within himself, a growing darkness that mirrored the creatures in his dreams. The nightmares were just the beginning. The darkness was growing stronger, feeding on his pain, his anger, his despair, and soon it would consume him entirely. The nightmares intensified, seeping into his waking hours like poison. The demonic entities, once confined to the darkness behind his eyelids, now flickered at the edge of his vision. They whispered promises of power, of release from his torment. Their voices, a chorus of shadows, tempted him, urged him to embrace the darkness. Robby tried to confide in Michael, to explain the terror that clawed at his sanity, but the words caught in his throat, choked by fear and shame. How could he explain the unexplainable, the horror that twisted his insides? So he suffered in silence, the weight of his secret growing heavier with each passing day. School became a blur of faces and voices, none of it feeling real. The whispers followed him down the crowded hallways, into the sterile confines of the classroom. He couldn't escape them. They were always there, a constant reminder of the darkness that threatened to consume him. Only in Michael's presence did Robby find a moment's respite. Michael's easy laughter and genuine warmth acted as a temporary shield against the encroaching shadows. But even Michael's light couldn't fully penetrate the growing darkness within Robby. The changes began subtly. Robby's reflection in the mirror seemed different. His eyes, once a dull blue, now held a strange intensity, a flicker of something primal and untamed. His skin, usually pale from the lack of sunlight, took on a faint reddish hue. He felt a strange energy coursing through his veins, a raw power that both terrified and exhilarated him. His temper, always simmering just below the surface, flared with alarming ease. He lashed out at classmates, his words laced with a venomous rage he couldn't control. Michael noticed the change in his friend. He saw the anger, the fear, the despair that seemed to radiate from Robby like heat from a fire. He tried to reach out to offer comfort and support, but Robby pushed him away, his words like shards of glass. Robby couldn't bear to drag Michael into his personal abyss. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was a contagion, a carrier of something dark and dangerous. He loved Michael too much to risk hurting him. So he retreated further into himself, isolating himself with his fear and his growing rage. One night, the nightmare bled into reality. Robby woke to the familiar sounds of his parents fighting. His father's voice, thick with alcohol and fury, shook the walls. His mother's pleas, laced with desperation and fear, tore at Robby's heart. He lay in bed, paralyzed by fear as the fight escalated. The crashing of furniture, the shattering of glass, the sounds of a struggle. Then a silence more terrifying than any scream. Robby crept out of bed, his blood turning to ice in his veins. The hallway was dark, lit only by a sliver of moonlight filtering through the window. He could smell it, the metallic tang of blood. He followed the scent to the living room, each step heavy with dread. The sight that greeted him stopped his heart. His father lay sprawled on the floor, his eyes staring vacantly at the ceiling. A pool of blood spread around him, staining the worn carpet a sickening crimson. Standing over him, her hands shaking, was his mother, her eyes wide with shock and something else. Triumph? Robby stared at the scene, his mind struggling to process the horror unfolding before him. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. His father, the source of his pain, his fear, was gone. And his mother, the victim, the ghost, stood over him, a bloody knife clutched in her hand. A wave of nausea washed over him, followed by a strange sense of detachment. It was as if he was watching the scene from a distance, a spectator to his own life. He felt nothing, no grief, no anger, no fear, only a chilling emptiness. That was the night the transformation began. The red tinge in his skin deepened, spreading like a rash. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, urging him to embrace the power that surged within him. Robby stopped going home. He couldn't bear to be in the same house as his mother, couldn't look at her without seeing the blood on her hands. He spent his nights wandering the streets, a solitary figure lost in the urban jungle. He couldn't hide the changes anymore. The red hue of his skin intensified, becoming a fiery crimson. His eyes burned with an unnatural light, a reflection of the inferno raging within him. The whispers were a constant torment, urging him to unleash the demon he was becoming. The jacket he always wore, his shield against the world's judgment, no longer fit. The fabric strained against his changing body, a symbol of the transformation he could no longer conceal. He discarded it in a back alley, leaving behind the last vestige of the boy he once was. He was no longer Robby Bankson. He was something else, something monstrous. The demon in his nightmares had awoken, and it was hungry. Michael, frantic with worry, searched for Robby everywhere. He knew something was terribly wrong. Robby's absence, his silence, screamed louder than any cry for help. He finally found Robby at their spot in the woods, the place where they had shared secrets and laughter. But the boy he found there was not the friend he knew. Robby sat on a fallen log, his head in his hands. His shoulders shook with silent sobs. He looked up as Michael approached, and for a fleeting moment Michael saw a flicker of the boy he knew. But the moment vanished as quickly as it appeared. The red glow surrounding Robby intensified, engulfing him in a fiery aura. His eyes, blazing with an unholy light, met Michael's, and a terrifying grin spread across his face. "It's too late, Michael," Robby hissed, his voice raspy and unfamiliar. "The darkness has me now." Robby's touch burned like fire. Michael recoiled instinctively, fear twisting like a cold blade in his gut. He'd found Robby, yes, but this creature wasn't Robby, not anymore. The red that had tinged Robby's skin was now ablaze, an inferno contained within human flesh. His eyes, once warm and full of life, crackled with a terrifying inner fire. Worst of all was the mark on Robby's forehead, a single searing symbol that pulsed like a beating heart. Michael knew instinctively what it represented. It was the mark of the beast. "Robby!" Michael choked out, the name a prayer on his lips. He reached out again, this time with a trembling hand, hoping to touch some remnant of his friend. "Don't!" Robby snarled, his voice a guttural growl. He flinched away from Michael's touch as if burned. "I warned you. It's too late." He stood abruptly, towering over Michael, his shadow a monstrous silhouette in the dappled sunlight filtering through the trees. The days that followed were a blur of fear and confusion for Michael. Robby, his friend, the boy who loved stories and whispered dreams of escape, was gone. In his place was a stranger, a creature of fire and shadow. He saw glimpses of Robby in fleeting moments, a flicker of pain in those burning eyes. But the darkness was winning. It coiled around Robby like a venomous serpent. He withdrew further into himself, isolating himself from everyone. He roamed the halls of Northgate High, a spectre. Michael watched helplessly as the transformation took hold. He tried talking to Robby, but Robby pushed him away. "Leave me alone," Robby would hiss. "This is my fate. This is who I am." But Michael refused to give up. He clung to the belief that somewhere deep inside the inferno, a flicker of his friend still remained. The school bullies, sensing Robby's vulnerability, seized the opportunity to torment him. They circled him like vultures, their laughter echoing cruelly in the hallways. They called him names, threw things at him, pushed him, shoved him, anything to elicit a reaction from the creature he was becoming. Robby, for the most part, ignored them. He walked through their taunts like a ghost, his face an impassive mask, his eyes burning with a cold fire that sent shivers down their spines. But Michael could see the effort it took for Robby to maintain his composure. He could see the muscles in his jaw clenching, the way his hands balled into fists. One day, during lunchtime in the crowded cafeteria, the taunting escalated. One of the bullies, a hulking boy named Jake, snatched Robby's lunch tray and dumped it on the floor. The cafeteria fell silent, everyone watching, waiting to see what would happen. "What are you going to do, freak?" Jake sneered, stepping closer to Robby, his voice dripping with malice. "Going to set me on fire with your demon eyes?" The other bullies laughed, their voices echoing cruelly in the sudden silence of the cafeteria. "Just walk away, Robby," Michael whispered, his hand gripping Robby's arm. He could feel the heat radiating from him like a furnace about to explode. "Don't let them win." Robby didn't move. He stood frozen, his back rigid, his head down. Michael could see the tremors running through his body, the effort it took to contain the inferno raging within him. "Yeah, freak, listen to your little boyfriend," Jake taunted, emboldened by Robby's lack of response. He reached out and shoved Robby hard in the chest, sending him stumbling backward. "Or what? You gonna cry to your mummy? Leave him alone!" Michael shouted, stepping in front of Robby. He knew it was futile, knew he was no match for Jake and his cronies, but he couldn't just stand there and watch as they tormented his friend. "Can't you see you're hurting him?" Jake just laughed, a cruel, humorless sound. "Hurting him," he mocked. "This thing isn't human, it's a monster." He took another step closer, his face inches from Michael's. "Get out of the way if you know what's good for you." But Robby moved. He didn't lash out at Jake, didn't retaliate against his tormentor. Instead, he turned, his entire body trembling with a power that seemed to crackle in the air around him. His head snapped up, and for the first time, Michael saw the full extent of the transformation. The red of his skin was almost blinding now, the glow emanating from him casting grotesque shadows on the faces of the terrified onlookers. His eyes were two burning embers in the heart of the inferno, radiating a power that stole their breath. A collective gasp rippled through the cafeteria as a wave of heat slammed into them, knocking them all back. Michael, still gripping Robby's arm, felt the searing heat but refused to let go. This was his friend, his Robby, no matter what form he took. "Robby, no!" Michael screamed, but his voice was lost in the roar that erupted from Robby's throat. The fire came without warning, erupting from Robby's body in a blinding flash of heat and light. It consumed everything in its path, melting metal, shattering glass, turning flesh to ash. Screams filled the air as students and teachers alike scrambled for safety, but there was nowhere to run. Michael, still clinging to Robby's arm, felt the fire lick at his skin, but it didn't burn. He looked up at his friend, his eyes wide with horror and disbelief, and saw a look of agonizing regret flash across Robby's face. Then, just as quickly as it began, it was over. The fire died down, leaving behind nothing but smoke and ash, and a deafening silence. Michael stood there, his ears ringing, his clothes smoking, his hand still outstretched, but it was empty. The world spun, a dizzying carousel of smoke and ash. Michael coughed, his lungs burning, his vision blurred by the remnants of the inferno. The cafeteria, once a place of laughter and light, was now a charred tomb. Twisted metal and shattered glass littered the floor, reflecting the flames that still danced in Michael's vision. He staggered to his feet, his hand instinctively reaching for Robby. His fingers closed around something cold and unyielding. He stared down, his stomach churning as he recognized the charred skeletal hand still clinging to his own. The weight of the hand, so light yet so heavy with meaning, sent a jolt of horror through him. Robby hadn't vanished into thin air. He hadn't simply disappeared. The fire, the inferno, it hadn't consumed him, it had transformed him, and in the process it had taken everything from him, including Michael. He stumbled back, a strangled cry escaping his lips as the truth sunk in. Robby was gone. He didn't know how long he stood there, numb with shock and grief, the skeletal hand crumbling to ash in his grasp. When he finally looked up, the world outside the cafeteria mirrored the inferno that raged within him. The fire hadn't stopped at the cafeteria walls. It had spread, a ravenous beast, consuming everything in its path. Flames danced across the school building, licking at the sky with hungry tongues. The screams of fleeing students and teachers were lost in the roar of the blaze. And at the heart of it all, a figure of fire and shadow stood triumphant, Robby. But not the Robby Michael knew. This Robby was wreathed in flames, his eyes burning with an infernal light, his laughter echoing with the fury of a demon unleashed. He watched in numb horror as Robby raised his hands, and the fire followed, spreading out from the school, engulfing the town in its fiery embrace. As the inferno raged around him, Michael felt a strange sense of detachment. The heat, the smoke, the screams, it all seemed distant, unreal. He was a spectator to the apocalypse, watching as the world burned around him. He looked at his hands, his skin blistered and charred, yet strangely numb. He felt nothing, no pain, no fear, no sorrow. The fire had taken everything from him, his friend, his hope, his future. He was an empty vessel, adrift in a sea of fire. Then he heard it, a voice, deep and resonant, echoing through the flames, calling his name. "Michael!" The voice boomed, shaking the very foundations of the earth. "Come to me, child, your time has come." He knew that voice. He turned, his gaze drawn to the heart of the inferno, where Robby stood, his body a silhouette of fire against the blazing sky. And as he watched, the flames parted, revealing a figure even more terrifying than the demon his friend had become. He stood tall and imposing, his skin as red as the flames that danced around him. Two horns, wicked and sharp, protruded from his forehead, framing eyes that burned with an infernal light. He wore a cruel smile on his lips, and his voice, when he spoke, dripped with honeyed malice. "Robby, my son," the devil said, his voice a caress and a threat all at once. "You have done well. You have embraced your destiny. Now come to me." "No, Robby!" Michael cried, his voice hoarse and raw. He stumbled forward, his body screaming in protest, his every instinct urging him to flee from the inferno. But he couldn't leave Robby, not now, not when his friend needed him the most. "Don't listen to him, Robby," he pleaded, his voice barely a whisper against the roar of the flames. "Fight it. Fight him. Remember who you are." Robby hesitated, his body trembling, the flames that consumed him flickering wildly. For a moment, Michael dared to hope. Maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late. Maybe he could reach that part of Robby, the part that still clung to the light. But the devil just laughed, a cold, humorless sound that echoed through the ruins of the town. "Foolish mortal," he sneered, his eyes burning with contempt. "You cannot fight fate. Robby is mine." And with a final, heart-wrenching cry, Robby surrendered. The flames that consumed him flared brighter than ever before, engulfing him in a blinding inferno. When the light subsided, he was gone. Only the devil remained, his smile triumphant, his eyes burning with infernal fire. He turned his gaze to Michael, and the smile vanished, replaced by a look of cold, calculating malice. "And now, child," he said, his voice like ice, "it is your turn." The flames around them roared, eager for their next victim. Michael closed his eyes, accepting his fate. He had nothing left to lose. He had failed to save his friend, but he would face his own demise with courage. The flames roared, a symphony of destruction and despair. Michael braced himself, welcoming the oblivion he believed awaited him, but the pain never came. He opened his eyes, his vision blurry, his lungs screaming for air. Instead of the searing heat of the inferno, he felt a strange coolness against his skin. He was no longer standing amidst the ruins of his town. He stood in a vast, desolate wasteland. The ground beneath his feet was scorched and barren, the sky above a swirling vortex of fire and ash. The air hung heavy with the stench of sulfur and the silence of 1,000 graveyards. And then he saw him, Robby. He stood at the edge of a fiery chasm, his back to Michael, his body engulfed in flames. But these flames were different. They were no longer the wild, uncontrolled inferno that had consumed their town. These flames burned with a cold, malevolent intensity, a reflection of the darkness that now held Robby captive. Robby's transformation was complete. The boy Michael had known, the boy who loved stories and dreamed of escape, was gone. In his place stood a creature of immense power and terrifying beauty. His skin glowed with an infernal light. His eyes burned with a cold fire, and his horns, once a symbol of his torment, were now a crown of dark majesty. "Michael," Robby said, his voice a hollow echo of its former self. But it wasn't the sound of his voice that chilled Michael to the bone, it was the utter lack of emotion, the absence of the warmth and humour that had once defined his friend. "What have they done to you?" Michael whispered, his heart breaking all over again. He took a step toward Robby, desperate to reach him, to break through the wall of darkness that separated them. "They?" Robby tilted his head, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. "There is only one master here, Michael, and he has given me everything I ever wanted." A figure emerged from the fiery chasm. Tall and imposing, wreathed in flames, the devil stood before them, his eyes burning with a cold, malevolent light. He placed a hand on Robby's shoulder, his touch sending ripples of fire through the air. "My son," the devil said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to shake the very foundations of this desolate world. "You have done well. You have embraced your destiny. And now the time has come for you to claim your birthright." Robby turned to face his father, his expression unreadable. "What would you have me do?" The devil's smile widened, revealing a glimpse of the torment that lay beneath his facade of power. "Unleash your fury upon this world, my son. Reduce it to ashes. Let them know the true meaning of despair." "Robby, don't!" Michael cried, his voice raw with desperation. "This isn't you! Fight it!" But Robby didn't even seem to hear him. He was lost in the darkness, consumed by the power. "Robby, please!" Michael pleaded, his voice breaking. He knew he couldn't fight Robby. He had to at least make Robby see that he wasn't alone. He lunged forward, ignoring the searing heat. "Remember our promise, Robby? We were going to be free." The flames flickered, struggling to maintain their hold. Maybe, just maybe, he could reach him. And then he heard Robby's laugh. It was hollow, devoid of any trace of the boy he had once known. "There is no escape, Michael," Robby said, his voice cold and empty. "Not for you." The flames roared back to life, engulfing Robby in their fiery embrace. Michael cried out, his hands desperately clutching at Robby's burning form, but it was no use. He was slipping away, dragged down into the abyss by the very power he had sought to control. "This isn't the end, Michael," Robby whispered. "It's only the beginning." And then he was gone. Michael remained on his knees, the ashes of his friends scattered around him like fallen snow. Each breath he drew tasted like sulfur and despair. Above, the fiery chasm pulsed with a malevolent heartbeat, a constant reminder of Robby's final, terrifying transformation. The world around him was a testament to his failure. Everything had burned, leaving only a silent, desolate wasteland. He had raged, he had bargained, he had pleaded with the heavens for a miracle. But the silence that met his cries was deafening. The truth settled upon him like the ash that clung to his clothes. Robby was gone. Slowly, Michael pushed himself to his feet. The ground beneath him felt alien, the very air he breathed heavy with malice. Yet a strange calm settled over him. The fight was over. Robby had made his choice. He looked up at the swirling vortex, a flicker of understanding igniting within the vast emptiness of his grief. He had sought to save Robby from the darkness, but perhaps in some twisted way, this was his salvation. Not a salvation of redemption, but a salvation of acceptance. A figure detached itself from the heart of the inferno, gliding towards Michael with an eerie grace. It was Robby, cloaked in flames that no longer scorched but seemed to emanate from within him, a part of him. His eyes, once filled with warmth and laughter, now burned with a cold fire, reflecting the abyss that now claimed him. "Michael," Robby spoke, his voice a chilling echo of its former self, stripped of all warmth, yet carrying a strange note of contentment. Michael met his gaze, no longer with fear, but with a weary acceptance. He saw no trace of the boy he had befriended, the boy who had shared his dreams and fears. Before him stood El Diablo, son of Satan, heir to a kingdom of fire and shadow. "This is who I am now," Robby said, his words hanging in the silent air. "This is my birthright. Join me, Michael. Embrace the power. Rule by my side." The offer hung between them, heavy with the weight of eternity. Michael glanced around at the scorched earth, the silent testament to his friend's transformation. This was Robby's doing. This was the price of his power, the burden of his inheritance. And in that moment, Michael understood. He could rage against the injustice, he could rail against the cruelty of fate, or he could accept the truth. Robby was gone. The boy he had known was lost, consumed by the very darkness he had sought to escape. Looking into Robby's cold, fiery eyes, Michael made his choice. He would honor the memory of his friend, not by joining him in this desolate kingdom, but by refusing to let the darkness extinguish the light they had once shared. "I will not rule by your side, Robby," Michael said, his voice firm, though his heart ached with a sorrow that would never fully heal. "But neither will I fight you. I will remember who you were, even if you no longer do." Robby's expression remained unchanged, his face an impassive mask, yet in the depths of his fiery eyes, Michael saw a flicker, a brief spark of something. Regret, longing, he couldn't be sure. Then you will bear witness to the New World Order, Robby stated, his voice echoing with a power that made the very air vibrate, a world ruled by fire and shadow, and you will remember who brought it forth. Michael watched as Robby El Diablo, son of Satan, ascended towards the fiery chasm, his form consumed by the flames, yet untouched, a king returning to his throne. As he disappeared into the inferno, a single tear traced a path down Michael's cheek. It wasn't a tear of fear or despair, it was a tear of remembrance. He looked down at his feet, at the scorched earth, and noticed a single, unburnt wildflower struggling to bloom amidst the ashes, a tiny spark of defiance in a world consumed by darkness, a memory of light in the face of oblivion. And Michael knew, with a certainty that defied the desolation around him, that the fight for Robby's soul, for the soul of humanity, was far from over.